Art has many functions, and these need not be consistent over time. We're going to, in this lecture, look at a few works of art that actually shift their function over the course of history. We're going to begin with the retablo of Maria de la Luz Casillas and her children, and you see her there kneeling in the lower left. Small retablos like this are used by individuals as an act of prayer. They are made by untrained artists, and they're often called folk art, naive art, call it what you will. The text tells us that this was made as a prayer to the Virgin, who we see floating above on the left, for the health and recovery of Maria following, as you can see in the lower right, an operation that she was going to have. And so she made this work herself as an act of devotion and an act of prayer. And these works can be found in church walls, but they can also be found in galleries, fancy and fine galleries in downtown Manhattan, where they're collected by collectors who recognize them as works of great interest and beauty. Though they are not made by quote-unquote artists, but ordinary people, and though they are not intended really as works of art, but as acts of devotion, they come to be collected, come to be reused, come to be viewed for their visual and cultural qualities. And so a work that begins in the church makes its way eventually into the gallery or museum. But of course that doesn't happen with whole churches. And here we see two chapels. One is French, one is Spanish. They're both from the Middle Ages. Pull up their details. These works give us a sense of medieval life and belief and worship by presenting to our eyes not only the architecture of the church, but the art as well. We see in the Fuentedueña chapel from San Juan de Tredos, the 12th century Spanish chapel, not only the great rounded arches over the narrow slit windows, but also the apse fresco, where we see the Virgin with the child seated on her lap and a series of angels and other smaller figures flanking them, and then majestic hanging, rough-hewn, the wooden crucifix suspended in the air, massive and mighty, looking down on the congregation. We see the altar itself with a smaller cross placed atop it. In the French chapel, chapel of Langon, to the left, we see the beautifully preserved stained glass. We see the tombs of people buried in this chapel. Now, take a close look at that one on the left. You see those little squared and rectangular labels affixed to the wall and standing by two of the tombs? What's going on here? Well, in fact, these entire church chapels are now in a museum. They're in the Cloisters Museum in Fort Tryon Park in New York City in way northern Manhattan, a wonderful place where I once worked. It's a hodgepodge of a building made up out of bits and pieces of real medieval architecture brought stone by stone from Europe and reassembled in Upper Manhattan. That is a real Spanish church apse, but it's no longer in Spain, and it's no longer really a church. This doesn't stop people of devotion from coming and praying. When I used to work there, I'd often see people kneeling in front of altars in prayer, genuflecting, bowing down to the floor before images of Christ and the saints. Now, the museum discouraged this, but it wasn't about to interrupt people in the middle of their devotions. But now it's a museum, and people are supposedly there to appreciate these works for their aesthetic qualities or what we can learn about a long-past culture. But one other thing people do there is they get married. Now, they're not supposed to because the Cloisters doesn't want heaps and heaps of wedding guests traipsing through. But of course, you can go to a museum wearing whatever you want. You can go to a museum wearing a wedding gown and a tuxedo. And so what I would see every now and again, only once every few months, would be a bride and groom seeming to be taking wedding photos in the gardens of the museum. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, a priest would pop up, marry him, and they'd all run out the back door. We didn't do much to try and stop them. So, art can change its function when its context changes, and architecture can change its function when context changes, but it still retains, for many people, its original use. Now, this raises a particular concern when it comes to the concept of the reliquary. A reliquary is an object housing, at least supposedly, a piece of the body of a saint. The finger of John the Baptist, the rib of St. Peter, the skull of a virgin martyr. Now, the works that you're seeing here are created with a process not that dissimilar from papier-mâché or plaster, and they are made around the skulls of these two women. Now, museums collect these works and they put them on display as objects of cultural or visual interest, and whenever possible, they remove the relics and return them to the Catholic Church from which they came. But if a work like these is constructed around the relic, often it cannot be removed. So what's to be done? Well, it stays there. And so, even though this work is now housed in a museum and supposedly being used for secular, non-religious purposes, nonetheless, it remains housing a piece of a dead saint, as it has for 500 years. Works of art are created an idea for their function, but that doesn't mean that that function will remain constant. Over time, they change, they shift, they are adopted intentionally and otherwise for a whole host of new and ever-changing functions.